Welcome. Welcome to Environmental Science 419, Introduction to Environmental Planning. And we've got a few guests. The students are going to present their findings with regards to the Clam Garden on Salt Spring Island. And I'd like to welcome a number of guests. We have Peter Luckham, Chair of the Islands Trust, and George Grams, who's chair of my local trust committee, but a trust member from Salt Spring Island, and a member from executive. So welcome, and thank you for joining us, and now you know where we are. Next time, it's a bit of a maze of getting here, and then we have some other guests. We've got, of course, Shelley Miller, who's been helping us with this project. Welcome, Shelley. And
your colleague.
Carrie McIntosh, who is a former student of mine in Masters of Environmental Management. And then I just got Leslie King, just a complete blank. So Leslie King is, you of course know Leslie, right? You've taken a class with her. And unfortunately, Audrey, I think, is in the field. So I've been trying to reach her, and she isn't able to attend, but she might be online. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the class.
Great. Good afternoon. So my name is Davison. I just actually want to start by thanking each and every one of you guys for taking the time out of what must be very busy days to come on down and be part of our presentation today about Clam Gardens and the Islands Trust. What you're about to see is actually the culmination of efforts from over 20 individuals, all of whom in a very short period of time will all have earned their Bachelor's of Science degree in Environmental Management. But who are we really? We come from all across Canada. That's us. We had a school photo taken about a week and a half ago. We come from as far away as the Northwest Territories. We come from as close as from quite literally just a few miles down the road. We're here to talk about the Clam Gardens. Now, Clam Gardens are a piece of kind of recently discovered First Nations history, and if you've never heard of a clam garden before, you're actually not alone. I personally hadn't prior to meeting our instructor, Derek. Now, in nature, clams are found along the shore environment in their natural habitat in what's called the clam bed. Now, the process of their natural habitat involves seasons, involves predation, nutrient availability in a natural ecosystem setting. Clam gardens, on the other hand, are actually a lot more exciting in that they're man-made. It's actually an engineered beach landscape, cultivated, built and maintained by the First Peoples for the purpose of improving and increasing the amount of available clam habitat. And in doing so, securing food, so it's food security, in leaner years and over the winter months. Now, they can be identified by a series of large stones, boulders pebbled, pushed to the low water mark, behind which is really a meticulously combed beach. It's aerated, and through the removal of the stones and various processes, they can actually garner between 2 and 4 times the amount of clam yield in the given area compared to natural clam beds. And if we compare that to what we know of First Nations people, or the current understanding of them as hunter-gatherers, it might actually be closer to farmers. They were engineering a landscape to have more food production. And by today's standards, that fits along agriculture, and hence the modern term of clam gardens. But if I describe it only in terms of food, I actually do a big disservice to the other large and significant part of clam gardens to the First Nations people, and that is the impact they had on spiritual and their social culture. There's some great videos. We'll provide you the links afterwards. This is Tom. He's an eco-tourist. He used to be in commercial salmon, but he does some amazing videos about clam gardens, their history, what they're about, and I encourage that. But this process, these sites, were used as a social and spiritual center, as an eco-cultural landscape. A place where skills were taught, knowledge learned, and the ancestry and their heritage passed on. It occurred on sites like these. And this has been going on for generations, up until, through colonialization, they're almost gone, almost forgotten. The history of these sites, their purpose, even how to identify them is only slowly becoming more front and center. And through the efforts of just a few people, Clam Gardens are actually about to be kind of vaulted back on the national stage. Through the Gulf Islands National Park Reserve, 2 Coast Salish Clam Gardens are actually in the process of reconstruction and restoration. So I'll get you a map of the particular locations. So we have one on Salt Spring Island, and we have a second small site, and that's on Russell Island, tucked into Fulford Harbor. On those 2 sites alone, 12, nearly a dozen other institutions and organizations are actually taking a vested interest in these 2 sites. 5 post-secondary educational institutions, 2 First Nations groups, $900,000 allocated over 5 years for the purpose of restoration and protection. And 3 research grants that have actually been secured for these 2 sites as well. And that's just 2 sites. Archaeologists from Simon Fraser University basically quoted as saying, these things are everywhere, all along the BC coast, as far up as Alaska, and anywhere that ecologically a clam garden could be supported, sure enough, the First Nations people have designed them there. And this really underlines the First Nations' understanding over thousands of years of ecological systems and ecological services that they can take advantage of. Our goal here really today is to demonstrate to the Islands Trust that the selective restoration and protection of clam gardens is actually not only possible and achievable, but it actually carries with it some quantifiable benefits. The largest of which is an opportunity like never before to engage with First Nations people and to demonstrate that even today, models like the clam gardens can be used as a baseline for food security and sustainable practices, given the global climate of food shortage that many say is coming. In preparation of vested interest from the Islands Trust, myself and my fellow presenters have outlined a series of considerations that may be encountered in the process of attempting to find and then preserve and protect these clam garden structures. To begin, Arvinder will follow up next and discuss septic and stormwater systems and how those systems may impact the clam gardens. We will have Michelle and Nancy deal with upland developments. That'll refer to things such as permits, zoning, I should say. Nancy will continue, Naomi, where is she? There you are. Naomi will continue with foreshore developments, and this will include things like permitting and docks. Now, since clam gardens are actually shoreline features, we wanted to give you a little bit of insight on how climate change mitigation measures can actually impact the clam gardens as well in regards to sea level rise. And then the last section provided by both Bailey and Heather will give you a series of actionable items, some recommendations that we followed based on systems that you already have in place or methods that you may not be currently be aware of on how to go about the protection, identification, and conservation of clam gardens. So without any further ado, once again, I'd like to thank everyone for being a part of this event today, and I'd like to welcome Arvinder to the front to get the presentation started. Thank you. Push the button.
Thank you, Peter, Gordon, Shelley, Leslie. I'm sorry, I missed your name,
Carrie.
just as you're a student. Wasn't it? Carrie? Thank you all for coming, taking time out of your day. So, before I start to talk about this, I want to relay a story that Derek told us. More of an Indian or a First Nation saying. He said that when the tide goes out, the table is set. So I take that to mean that for generations, for millennia, First Nations people would use the intertidal land as a place for food, a place to grow food. And that's typically what the clam gardens are. So, and what they also did was they afforded the First Nations a level of security like Duke had mentioned. So they could grow the clams during the summer months and harvest them when the salmon runs were a little bit low, or there were some other food constraints against them. So they used it as a store. Unfortunately, as you can see right now, the store is closed. So what we're looking at right now is a current closure of the Fulford Harbor to shellfish fisheries. I apologize for that entire fumbling. It is closed right now due to something called sanitary conditions. One of our team members, Jeff, has emailed DFO to ask what exactly that means. And we're probably not going to get an email back before the end of this presentation, so when we do, we'll forward it along to Shelley. But sanitary can generally mean fecal contamination or chemical levels that are a little bit higher than what Environment Canada has suggested. So we're going to talk a little bit more about how that could happen. So that's a picture of the Clam Garden site. I believe, Jeff, you took that picture? Jeff took that picture from a boat with a lens about yay big. So it's a fantastic shot. All of the hills, homes on top of that, are sloping downwards towards the inner harbor. So if there is any runoff of roadways, malfunctioning septic tanks, fertilizers and pesticides that have been applied to lawns and gardens, they're all going to end up right here on the intertidal area. That place is populated by clams. Clams are filter feeders. So what they're going to do is they're going to ingest the toxins and they can bioaccumulate the toxins within their tissues. If that happens and a human being eats them, you're liable to get sick, because it doesn't take a lot of bacteria to make somebody sick from fecal contamination. So before we can talk about cleaning up or restoring the clam gardens, we need to talk about how we can stop this source of possible contamination. One way would be to have properly designed drainage systems that move stormwater away from the foreshore site, and making sure that the septic systems that are prevalent on Salt Spring Island are properly maintained. Now further to this, students in reading, this actually aligns with 3 out of the 10 priorities that the Islands Trust had put out. Prominently, the 3 that I chose were preserve and protect the natural environment, advocate for the coastal shores and marine area, and what really needs to be done a lot of times is strengthen our relationships with the First Nations. So the clam gardens are a really nice first step in hitting at least 3 of the 10 priorities that have been identified. Okay. That's it for me. I'm going to pass this over to Michelle Hill, and she's going to talk about the Uplands Development.
Thank you. So I'm going to go over the Upland Development and impacts. So I'm going to talk about a brief history of the development, current zoning, environmentally sensitive areas, and effects on upland development, and that will be between myself and Nancy. Okay, so here shows one of the first maps. So you can see this is Salt Spring Island. So this is the clam gardens in here. And so when the settlers first came to Salt Spring Island, they noticed that there was some archaeological finds. There were shellmans in the area, and as far inland as Mount Tuam. And settlers in the area began agriculture practices. And one thing that they noticed was the southern area was good for sheep. That was one of their comments. Okay, so the current zoning, you can see that this is the agricultural area. So in agriculture, you can use primary agriculture, which we would expect, and you can also have campsites. So within your current bylaws. Right in here, so this is going to be the clam gardens. Right in here you have rural. So in rural, you'll notice there's a whole gamut of things that can be permitted in a rural setting. So not only can you have dwellings, you can have dental, you can have a cemetery, you can have an animal hospital, you can have seasonal cottages, you can have a vet clinic, you can have absolutely everything in a rural, which is surprising. And that's right next to the clam gardens. So in this part, it shows the ecosystems. So you'll notice that there's quite a few polygons. So that orange area would be an example of a polygon. So within each polygon, it's broken down into how much is mature forest and how much is open. So you noticed in 1740, it has 100% dug fir stand. So it's not impacted at this point. You'll notice that this one has 60% dug fir, 20% western red cedar, and 20% young forest. So that's like your pole sapling, not mature trees. If you notice the one at the very top, I can't quite reach, you'll notice that 70% coverage is residential. So that's been open. There's grass, there's buildings, there's roadways, and 30 of it is young forest. So that whole area has been impacted. Okay, other example, you'll notice 60% coverage of 40% rural reservation, or rural residential, 40 with no vegetation at all. And this is right adjacent to the Clam Gardens, so this is going to have an impact. And we'll get to that. Just not remember those numbers. And Nancy's going to talk about.
All right, Upland, yeah, so thank you, Michelle. So I'm Nancy. I just want to talk a little bit about Upland Development effects. So in terms of what Michelle's already identified in the different polygons is some areas that already have 70% development areas. And what if there was more upland development? So further into the agricultural area as well as further into the rural areas. So that means if you're developing those areas more, you're clearing forest, you're also increasing building density, and perhaps maybe we're actually increasing the amount of paving. So are we paving driveways? Are we paving more roads because we're building more development? So that's, if we are doing all these things, what we will see is increased runoff and also decreased soil stability. So in terms of increased runoff, our vendors already pointed out that that could bring more nutrients down to the clam gardens and have an impact that way. The little graph that I have here is just to show kind of the differences on when you have an area that's, that doesn't have any buildings and that's just natural forest, that there's only maybe 10% runoff. Anytime it rains, 10% runs off down the slope, and there's actually 50% infiltration, so that actually goes into the groundwater. The moment that you start increasing building, clearing some trees, that runoff increases. And what we're seeing in the two bottom pictures is somewhere in between that, that orange zone that the Michelle mentioned, in terms of 70% of rural and residential, we're seeing an increase in runoff between 30 and 50%. So all that water is actually running down the hill with potential pollutants that could actually get to the clam gardens. So that's some of the impacts on further development of that. On the next slide. And then also we have to look at any water sources in the area for the clam gardens. And so this is a map that I took from the Islands Trust mapping site, and it's the layer for the watersheds. So the red outlines are the different watersheds. And this area here is roughly where the clam garden are set, and just that area north is one of the creeks. I couldn't find a name for the creek, so we'll just say it's upland of the clam gardens. And that area is in and around agricultural land. But that also could be developed further or even more residential areas. So anytime that you're developing near a water source, that provides a channel for any of the pollutants. So anything that you're putting on the agricultural fields in terms of fertilizers, maybe even your manure, all that could run down into the creek, into the harbor, and that is just upstream of the clam gardens. That actually can migrate in those areas and have an impact on those clam gardens. So some of the current issues in terms of looking at the different zoning bylaws, a lot of the different staff reports that I've researched over the last couple of weeks. What was really surprising is the ability for the rural properties to be subdivided into 0.6 hectare lots. So all of a sudden you have these residential areas where usually it's about 2 to 6 hectares where you can have one dwelling. Each of those lots can be divided into 0.6 hectares. So all of a sudden the potential for putting more residents, increasing that runoff really increases. Currently right now, the Salt Spring Island is looking at making changes to its industrial land uses, actually even changing it to being called general employment. In one of the reports I read that there's even considering of rezoning agricultural land reserve. So even though this may not be in the area of the clam gardens, this is happening somewhere else on the island. So that's not to say that at some point could that happen upland of the clam gardens. So that's just something to be aware of. Also found in the reports, somewhere else on the island, again not necessarily in the area of the clam gardens, there was an area where shoreline development was allowed within 1.5 meters of the natural boundary of the sea. And that same property, they're seeking an application to build a seawall right at that natural boundary. So that, again, that's not necessarily happening in the area of the clam gardens, but that's a potential. There's also an interesting project that's being undertaken right now in terms of doing an inventory of the First Nation sites all along the island. But right now, Due to the size of the scope and the potential of having so many more sites to identify, the project is only scoped right now to identify current sites. So they won't be necessarily able to add new sites to that potential, to that inventory. But that's still something that maybe in the future could be used. But yeah, this is something that we've uncovered in terms of upland developments and some of the potential risks. So now I'll turn it over to Naomi to talk about foreshore development. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Naomi, and I'll be talking to you a little bit about basically a background on the infrastructure in the foreshore area, as well as talking to the jurisdictional authority a little bit and some of that application process of putting in a dock. And so just a little bit of background first. We do have about 26,000 kilometers of shoreline in British Columbia, and it's appealing for the aquaculture industry because we have mild climate, sheltered bays, and generally good water quality. So at present there's about 460 licensed shellfish or aquaculture locations around the province, and you can see them indicated here in the purple. And this does represent a multi-million-dollar year-round industry at the moment. So why are we concerned with foreshore development? There are short and long-term impacts to dock installation in the foreshore environment, which can negatively impact the clam gardens and other aquatic communities in the intertidal zone. And for those of you who are unaware, the foreshore is simply the area between the high and low water mark. So the short-term impacts, as some of you may imagine, would occur during the installation of the pilings and the structure themselves. And these activities generally require heavy equipment and cause great disturbance to the area. During the installation, there can be damage or removal of riparian vegetation as well, which could lead to soil exposure and subsequent erosion. And of course, there's a potential for a spill at any time from the heavy equipment. After the installation has been put in place, the structure would naturally hinder access to the clam gardens, and it would potentially influence the sedimentation patterns in the area. And should wood materials be used, quite often wood is treated with creosote, and that does leach into the water over time, and this petroleum contaminant could make the clams unfit for human consumption. And as well, the boating activities would potentially negatively impact the area. Turbulence from the boat propellers could affect the clam gardens, rock walls, and surrounding sediment, as well as any leaks from those vessels. So this gives a bit of a breakdown of the jurisdictional boundaries, which is good to take note of. British Columbia doesn't have any one specific law devoted to protecting the near shore. Instead, there are various laws, so federal, provincial, municipal, and that would encompass the Islands Trust as well. And the majority of the land is under the jurisdiction of the provincial government. We know that to be Crown land, and that would encompass the foreshore. And typically the area above the high water line, especially in our area of interest, would be privately owned. So just an overview of the application process. If somebody were to wish to apply to put a dock in our area there, the application process involves various government agencies. Some of them are listed, or they're all listed here. So a property owner would have to acquire a permit. For example, Island Trust outlines the foreshore development allowances, and any group wanting to construct a private or public dock would have to consult Islands Trust. And docks must also be in compliance with the Salt Spring Island Official Community Plan, OCP. So the main governing body that would oversee the application process is the Forest Lands and Natural Resources, and one would go through the front counter. And they ensure that all requirements are met, and they also consult with First Nations. So the province is actually legally obligated to refer to First Nations and consult on any land application and be given their concerns or recommendations. However, that said, it's worth taking note that those agencies are quite often inundated with referrals. And if the area has not been flagged as as having First Nation significance or as being designated as an archaeological site, then it may be missed during that application process. So just touching on the existing foreshore use and zoning here, the Islands Trust delineates land use within the Salt Spring Island Land Use Bylaw number 355, and the Clam Garden Shoreline of Interest is designated as Shoreline 6 or S6 as designated. And so this allows for a variety of uses that include navigational uses, private floats and non-commercial buoys for moorage, and private docks and floats for boat wharfage. And within the Pacific Island Trust Bylaw 434, foreshore development permits are required under Development Permit 3 for any construction within this Shoreline 6 area. The development permit area includes shoreline waters and natural fish and wildlife habitat that could be adversely affected or impacted by development. And as defined by bylaw number 355, development is permitted provided it does not result in the removal or permanent shading of eelgrass or kelp beds, and provided it is not located within 125 meters of a clam bed. However, it's important to note that in the area of interest, in the Salt Spring Island Official Community Plan Map 10 in the appendices, that this area is not designated to have this cultural significance yet. And I'll just show you on the map here. So it's not currently defined. So this is map 10. It's the environmentally sensitive habitat and Salt Spring in the Salt Spring Island Official Community Appendix. And so we've got there's the area of interest. And we can see that it's not currently, it doesn't have the Clam Gardens defined there. So that would be something that we would want to look at. I will hand it over to Mike here. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mike Lowe, and I'm going to be talking to you about some of those gloomy effects from climate change and their with respect to the clam gardens. You will see how global climate change, scaled to local dimensions, is a major risk to the abundance, distribution, and existence of clam gardens in the Salt Spring Islands. I will be talking about how ocean acidification alters the way clams can form their shells and impact their access to oxygenated water, and how changing oceanic temperatures and weather patterns can impact the very specific niches in which the clam gardens exist. My colleague Ashley will then be letting you know about some of the impacts of rising sea levels and how human reactions to the sea level rise can cause shifts in the distribution of clams. So, chemical processes. There are a number of chemical changes occurring in the ocean that are a result of global warming and play a key role in the development of clam gardens. Rising concentrations of atmospheric carbon dioxide can reduce the pH of the ocean water, causing acidification, which will decrease clamshell formation. The effects of acidification have already been observed in shellfish hatcheries along North American west coast, and will continue to worsen as carbon dioxide increase. More intense rain events will also lead to higher runoff rates and increased erosion of surface material, nutrients, and contaminants. High loading of phosphorus, nitrogen, and other pollutants can lead to a decreased water quality and occurrence of harmful bacteria. The combination of increased water temperature and nutrient runoff pose a risk to dissolved oxygen levels that can lead to oxygen dead zones. The changes in temperature will also affect upwelling and the flow of ocean currents. Increased surface temperatures will lead to a change in the density structure of the upper ocean. By changing this density, there will be a decrease in vertical mixing. The water that comes up from the lower parts brings the food up to the surface. There will be a decrease in this, and this is important to the ecosystem in the Salish Sea. Precipitation and evaporation patterns will also change. In the Salish Sea area, there will be an increased evaporation and decreased precipitation, which has already been observed. Changes to the timing and volume of freshwater runoff into coastal marine waters will also lead to changes in turbidity. The change to these environmental conditions can lead to those which favor the growth of the hazardous algal blooms, which occupy shellfish and are deadly. Climate change will affect the ecosystems of clam gardens and the specific niches in which they exist. However, these changes will not occur overnight, and the impending effects should be taken seriously by landowners and be seen as another obstacle to Aboriginals practicing their culture. Thank you.
My name is Ashley Raby, and I will be discussing sea level rise and human response to sea level rise. So, as we know, one of the most well-known climate change effects is the rise of the sea level. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, sea levels are predicted to continue to rise. In the 20th century, sea level rose 8 centimeters in Victoria and 4 centimeters in Vancouver. This image shows the sea level changes that have occurred over the last 10,000 years. Sea level rise will alter the duration, frequency, and intensity of shore inundation and tidal current speeds. These changes result in coarser sediment grain size, steeper bank slopes, and increased exposure to wave action, all affecting the clam's ability to filter feed. These negative environmental impacts are intensified by coastal development pressures. As the sea levels continue to rise, coastal communities often prevent intertidal habitats from moving inland. So there are 3 human response approaches to sea level rise. Accommodation, which is the do-nothing approach, the retreat approach, which is moving away from these problem areas, and protection. The protection approach prevents the interaction between the sea and the shore and is very common. So there's a variety of methods that property owners can take to armor their properties, each with their own negative effects on the nearby clam gardens. Hard approaches fix the location of the coast at the time of construction. The most common hard approach is the construction of seawalls. These are designed to decrease erosion effects of the wave action, and they harden the shoreline, reducing the ability for the shoreline to adjust naturally. Other hard approaches include concrete shoring, revetments, breakwaters, groins, and gabions. Each method has its own level of effectiveness and maintenance requirements. So the primary adverse effect of these structures is passive erosion. The structures prevent erosion, resulting in a gradual loss of the beach sediments over time. Ecological impacts include the loss of ecological services, habitat, and a decrease in biodiversity. So a softer approach to property protection is beach nourishment. This is the method of moving offshore sediments onshore or replenishing the beach with off-site materials. The objective of this approach is to widen the beach and decrease wave energy hitting the cliffs. The approach is temporary and it requires regular replenishment. So during this process, the site becomes a construction zone, which could result in physical damage to the clam gardens. The method could also increase the fluctuation in sediment substrate and depth, which would affect the clam garden conditions. So here you can see an example of the traditional approach to property armoring. You can see this photo on the left. There is no intertidal zone, and outside the range of this photo is likely a beach area experiencing increased erosion. So this landowner invested in the change to the photo of your right, and you can see now that the property now features a gradual slope with an intertidal zone, and it allows for that natural sea to shore interaction. I'd like to introduce Heather, who will be introducing management recommendations.
Hello everyone. I would like to summarize some of the recommendations our class has for protecting the clam gardens. Recommendations for the foreshore development include shared community docks and identification of clam beds in the environmental sensitive habitat appendix. The climate change section recommends both a professional geotechnical engineering assessment and a professional biologist assessment of the area. The Upland Developments recommend that any changing of zoning be done so carefully and with considerations to the increased number of dwellings this change will allow. And the septic and stormwater recommendations are to ensure residents are aware of septic maintenance schedules and required drainage plans to ensure no net increase in runoff. These recommendations and more will be available to you after the presentation. Public engagement is going to be important so as to mitigate concerns from property owners. We think a good method of doing this would be holding a community clam bake, much like when a community gets together for a salmon release. While the clams within Fulford Harbour are not currently edible, events like this still have the means for re-education of the traditional use of clam gardens and why the practice is so important. Invites could go out to First Nations elders and figureheads of the local Salt Springs community. An important step of public engagement is going to be public education. Some means of doing this is having information booths at busy local sites, such as the Salt Spring Market, to help with public understanding and perception. Many residents quite literally have a clam garden in their backyard, so awareness is going to be key. These methods could also be used to educate all levels of government on the clam gardens and their importance. Another option is updating the current mapping of coastal sites on location and off to include the Fulford Harbour clam gardens. This would be significantly helpful for public awareness. Another recommendation we have is protecting the proposed National Marina Conservation Area, which currently includes Fulford Harbour. This could be amended to include a marine component that would be ideal for the gardens. I would like to now introduce Bailey, who will speak for the last portion of our presentation.
Almost there. So I'm Bailey, and I'm going to talk to you about how the Trust can possibly look to legislation to help protect the clam gardens, since a few of our recommendations include changing bylaws and other legislation practices to achieve that greater level of protection. Under Section 488 of the Local Government Act, the Trust can designate the area that encompasses the clam gardens as a development permit area. And they can do that under one or more of the purposes of the subsections listed there. If the Trust designates the clam gardens as a development permit area, it would also have to be described in the official community plan with justification as to why they've included that in the community plan. The benefit of doing this is that the clam gardens area will then have a deeper protection, and any property owner wishing to develop within that area must obtain a development permit before subdividing the land, constructing, adding to, or altering the building, in which just provides that additional protection. Another recommendation of ours is to include the involvement of First Nation communities and their leaders. However, all too often these communities are underfunded and under-resourced, and they just may not have the capacity to participate in these events. The federal program, Aboriginal Aquatic Resource and Oceans Management Program, was developed to aid in the renewal of the Aboriginal fisheries strategy, and it provides funding to help Aboriginal groups to participate effectively and in advisory and decision-making processes that include establishing aquatic resource and oceans management bodies. We feel that the Aboriginal involvement in the protection of the clam gardens is essential, and programs such as ARRU can help strengthen the relationship between the governing bodies and the local Aboriginal communities. And conservancies are crown lands that have been set aside for the reasons listed here. A conservancy designation recognizes the importance of natural areas for First Nations for social, cultural, and ceremonial uses, but it also allows for a variety of other economic activities including commercial logging, mining, and hydroelectric power generation. However, any of these commercial activities must not impede with the primary purpose of the conservancy. So clam gardens are an important piece in the history of people in British Columbia. They provide physical evidence on how and where people lived in the past and how and can be an important piece of the puzzle when it comes to solving the growing demand for seafood by providing a sustainable solution for harvesting shellfish and continuing on food security. However, as we have heard, this food security and way of life is deeply at risk due to septic and stormwater issues, an increase in both upland and foreshore development, and the impacts of climate change. We hope that our presentation has brought to light the importance of the clam gardens and why there is a need for them to be protected, because not only are they a link to our past, but a possible solution in the future, as they are an important place of learning for the entire community. Thank you for taking the time for listening to our presentation today.